JOMOCast listeners, Hover would love to find a domain name for your passion. They'll automatically take 10% off your first order at the checkout using promo code JOMOCast. My name is Christina Crook, and I am the author of The Joy of Missing Out. I want to welcome you to the JOMOCast, a brand new podcast for founders and creators seeking joy in a digital age. JOMO is the joy of missing out on the right things. Life-taking things like toxic hustle, comparison, disconnection, and digital drain in order to make space for life-giving commitments that bring us peace, love, meaning, and joy. I am still riding an absolute high from the podcast launch party we hosted here in Toronto, co-hosted with Artery. And today we're going to be hearing from the co-founder of Artery. Artery is a startup that you can kind of describe as Airbnb meets Eventbrite. People list their spaces, and it could be a living room or a back patio or a loft or any kind of space, and matches people, the hosts, with performers to create these intimate showcases, these intimate shows in people's homes and unusual spaces. And their tagline is "Every space is a stage." And they were the perfect partner for the JOMOCast launch party to celebrate things joyfully. We had an incredible experimental cello duo called VC2 Play, and everyone that was in the room that evening, that room was bursting with people, described what a joyful experience it was. And it was truly a joyful experience for me. It's incredible what Salimah and her co-founder Vladik have created in Artery. It is a very unusual tech startup in the sense that their goal with their company is to reduce loneliness and increase greater offline connection, people gathering in real time and space. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with me and Salimah about reducing loneliness and increasing joy in a digital age. Can you properly tell me how to say your last name? I say it Ebrahim. Is it Ebrahim?
So I say Salimah Ibrahim.
Ibrahim.
It's interesting about my last name. It's spelled Ebrahim. And it's really helped me navigate borders in an interesting way just for that reason. Abraham with an A or Ibrahim with an A is traditionally Jewish, and I is Muslim. And so I literally would walk through borders in going into, Jerusalem or Israel from Palestine and just say, they say, "What is this?" And I'd say, it's neutral. And they would say, "Okay." And they would let me in. So it's a question I feel really calm about because I'm like, I'm going to get through the border when you ask me that. So
that's amazing.
So on certain days, it'll be what it needs to be.
So Salimah, as you know, I have been on this quest to amplify the conversation around how to live well with technology. And you are in such an interesting space because you are the co-founder of a startup. You are a co-founder of a tech company by way of journalism, by way of community building and activism. So you're a really unique person in this space. And I think the conversation I'm hoping to have with you today is about why building trusting communities is important to you, and sort of, but to begin, really where the Artery story began for you personally.
Great. It's wonderful to be here, Christina. It's since the first day we met that has resonated with me, sort of your mission around this. And certainly as we have been building Artery, and we'll get into that later, that the importance of that has become clearer and clearer. For me, Artery began several years ago when I was in grad school. I'm a journalist. I worked as a journalist mostly in the Middle East and Africa, also covered a lot of U.S. presidential politics. And I met my co-founder in grad school, and he was a journalist. And we talked a lot about our experiences, as you would do. And we shared our experiences, his mostly as a journalist in Russia and the South Caucasus, mine in the Middle East, as I mentioned. And we also talked about how hard writing about culture and another culture can be. Writing about culture isn't just writing about, the musician or the artist. Culture is about the room we're in. How people enter, where they sit, how they greet their friends, how they joke with their neighbor. And often, I think through both of our careers, we realize that seeing the small stuff up close is the only way to understand the really big stuff. And it was out of that conversation of creating a platform that would connect people to the local culture and communities of a place, that the idea of Artery was born. I think for me, it had that conversation that I ended up having with my co-founder Vladik, we started in 2012, really began for me. I think I found myself at grad school. I found myself having this year of a bit of a crisis with my career, that had arisen from feeling disconnection, with this basic idea of just feeling like we are all increasingly disconnected, even though we have all this information and all this connectivity connecting us. And where that personally struck for me was, I had moved to the Middle East when I was, right after university. I was 21 years old, got a bag, landed in Cairo. And my whole intention, especially that was right around the Iraq War, just after 9/11, there was so much misunderstanding and even this perceived clash of civilizations. And it just seemed to me like a caricature of two sides. And my whole mission was, and I think many journalists and writers share this, was to travel and to write about the other so that you could see the other. And that was really, really critical. And after about a decade of trying to do that, when you're over there and you're over in Damascus, you're over in Cairo, or you're over in Amman, you know that you're putting out a volume of information together with other journalists, and you hope that people are reading, and you hope that other is being seen. You don't need to like the individual I'm writing about in Jordan, but it's important that you see them, and vice versa. And I think when I came back and was full-time sort of back and in New York at that point, I realized that threshold wasn't being met. And that in this sort of decade between 9/11 and sort of 2011 it was then, I thought we don't really know more about who a Syrian is, who an Iraqi is, what they care about, what they eat, what their culture is. And it sort of hit me that if we can't see someone for who they are and see them as ourselves and have that type of empathy, then no amount of information about the threats they're under or the insecurity in their region will move us to act. And the cycle continues. And so I had a real crisis around 20, growing into 2011, where, I felt here I was a young journalist, and because I had bylines from what people in Washington or Toronto would consider exotic places, my stock was rising. And yet I felt a decade on that we weren't moving that forward, and so that's when some of the conversations began, when I stopped to think about what actually connects us.
Was there a sense at any point that you were sort of shouting into the ether that the internet had sort of created a space where there was too much information, and like you were saying, you were hoping that people were reading what you were putting out into the world, but it's so amplified. And so I think what I hear you saying is that you were really reflecting on the power of a single story.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because the media landscape, even from when I was sort of beginning as a journalist in foreign correspondence in sort of 03, 04, this is like pre-mobile, right? The internet was still a hybrid part of our lives, right? And not the sort of half of ourselves that it feels like it is today. And there still was, a few papers everyone read, a few cable news stations. And while that had, that could be problematic also in other ways, because there was only a certain number of voices that were telling the story, we all seem to have a similar set of facts. And because there was, you'd read the paper, you listen to 6 o'clock news, you'd get a digest of a bit of everything. And I think what happened was, in the last decade, the last 15 years, there's actually been almost a renaissance of information. Like we have more quality documentaries, long form books than we ever blogs, informative tweets. And I say that at a time when, there's a lot of uninformative tweets out there, but a lot of great content. And so the problem was never content, but I think two things. I think the balkanization of the media I think the fact that there was noise, I think the fact that people were now going and you could literally go through and try to figure out what you wanted to know in the news and be ignorant to everything else. All of these things were really overwhelming. And, again, I think there's something even deeper than just content, is that you need to spend time with your neighbor. You need to spend time in your community, you need to spend time with people, to have that type of curiosity, that kind of trust muscle. And
I would also add to that just that we need those relationships to make meaning, to make sense of the information that we're receiving.
Absolutely. And I don't jump the gun on this, but that's something really that has sort of catalyzed and really energized the work around Artery, especially in the last year, even more so as we started piloting.
So bring us back to 2011 and that sort of crisis point. Like, where did this all begin for you? I mean, you've already taken us through part of the story, but then you're in grad school, you're with Vlad.
Vlad and a bunch of other sort of, journalists that had been in the field, ranging ages from sort of late 20s to kind of mid 40s. So really interesting experience.
Yeah, and set the scene. You're at what school, you're studying what, so just kind of paint a picture for us.
I'm in New York. I'm at Columbia University, and I had before journalism, I had been involved in building an environmental movement, an environmental nonprofit, sort of from my teens, that overlapped with my journalism career, but it was over a decade, kind of into my 20s.
As most teens do.
Well, this is the thing. It started out as a letter writing campaign, right? That we thought was going to last a few months. And it was sort of around the Kids for Saving Earth Club and trying to write letters in our backyard. And all of a sudden, one step led to another. And we certainly did not expect that we started in my colleague Simon's basement over burgers and chocolate cake. Jackson, trying to save trying to think about how we would write a letter or create a letter writing campaign to save BC's spirit bear. And if you had told us then, when we were teens, that it would turn over a decade into like a 6 million member network in 64 countries, and we saved the spirit bear. I went to that was yes. Oh, it's
my daughter just joined the Earth Rangers.
She did
today on the internet.
Today,
she's found out about the Earth Rangers, and you can sign up and sort of create, sign on to this commitment to learn more about nature and to support our environment and all of these things. So I can't wait to tell her about you and the spirit bear.
It was literally signing up
small. Right?
I think Safeway, which was obviously a grocery chain that was really big in BC. They had a Kids for Saving Earth Club that I first heard about when I was 11 years old, and joined that, and we cleaned up some parks. Exactly that. That's what it looks like. And that's what it even looks like through all of even as it scales. It's about those individual actions and finding a place to start. So I'll say with finding this, being and having had a background as an activist, and then knowing that I always wanted to see the world through a writer's lens, through a journalist lens, when I hit this sort of crisis point in 2011, I thought, obviously there's a medium and longer term view towards writing, and it's critical. And I have so many colleagues who have spent, decades and huge sacrifices telling the story. And so I was never conflicted about the role of journalism, but I thought, I have a few other skills too. Maybe I go work at the UN, maybe I go work at the IRC. Like it's to me, it seemed very critical and very just devastating, actually, that I was here with seeing my stock rising as a journalist, and I was writing about people who I thought seemed less and less understood. So for me, Artery began at a very macro level, in a lot of ways. And so when Vladik and I started talking at the, we were both actually in a science journalism program at the Columbia Journalism School. He was working very unlikely beginnings to Artery, one would think. Yes. He was working on a big exploration and a big narrative science piece on whether fish feel pain, and looking at cognitive animal behavior and understanding. And I was actually thinking at that point, well, I've got this environmental background and I've covered a lot of conflict. And so I was looking at the nexus of environmental security, looking at environmental war and peace. And I thought I was coming to Columbia to have a bit of an exhale after being in the field and to work on the beginnings of a book around environmental security. And whether that led me in a journalism path or an activism path was totally open to that. But it was in that year when I didn't have any agenda or intention, that I was surrounded by a lot of friends and colleagues who happened to all be in New York at that time. And I love to cook. And we had a lot of meals at my home. And I just started talking about, we started talking about our lives in these places that we had lived in. And I started talking about the modern jazz scene in Cairo, in Egypt, the hip hop scene in Beirut, Aman's poetry scene. And that's really where I realized that, wow, in those moments, like really smart, well-traveled people, and some who hadn't traveled that much, but who sort of had a sense of the world, I could see were even surprised by that. And it was amazing because I thought in that moment about talking about modern jazz in Cairo, more sort of ended up happening around that feeling of, wanting, of seeing the other than almost in anything I'd ever written. I felt that. And it was this huge kind of like over the head. Of course, culture is always the powerful lens through which we see each other. I don't need to know about a region or a context or a history, but if I connect with a piece of music or a play or an idea, I'm connected to you. And so, yeah, that's how those two things coming together led us to, quit our jobs and build Artery.
Incredible.
Yeah.
That is such an incredible story. So, I remember probably almost a year ago now having a conversation with you where we were talking about technology, and we can talk often about the ways that it connects us, the ways that it isolates us. But you and I had this incredible conversation about the ways in which the internet has, sort of unexpectedly created these trusting communities. Even 5 years ago, it would have been maybe terrifying even to get into the back of a stranger's car. It would have been strange to go and stay in a stranger's home. And yet through things like Airbnb and Lyft and Uber, this has become commonplace. And it's actually started to sort of weave these new webs of trust within communities. And I think that is a huge value to what the internet has done for us. And I know that you're sort of wanting to build on that. You are already in so many different countries and communities through Artery. Can you kind of take us into that story?
Yeah, I think it's such a, I think sometimes, when we're in a process of such transformative change, and I think we look often to what's happening technologically around us. We look to specifically the technology. I think what's really interests me is these sort of normative shifts that are happening, which is what you're talking about. And I think right now, because we're in the early days of take the sharing economy, there are imperfect expressions of that, and there are challenges for any of these companies. And whether you like Airbnb or Lyft or Uber as companies, that to me is separate from the story, because the shift that they're engendering around exactly that. 5, 6, 7 years ago, the idea of getting into a stranger's car or staying in a stranger's home was not only not there, but it was crazy. And today it's in some ways aspirational. And that shift is more powerful than any one company. And each year that goes by with these new types of opportunities to trust each other in different ways, I think allows for so much more. And I really look at, something like Artery could not exist without the cultures of Kickstarter or Airbnb or Lyft or any of those. And this is where I think it's really interesting, is that this is the moment we're in, where understanding that what is the responsibility of the architects of the sharing economy and of these trusting communities, but then also really to ask ourselves a really interesting question, aside from booking a car or staying in accommodation, what else does this allow for? What else does this trust allow for? And that's where I get really, really excited. And if you'll actually just let me connect it back to what we were just saying before, when we began Artery, which is essentially a platform that lets anyone open up their living room, their backyard, their rooftop to an intimate cultural experience that anyone can attend. That's the basic idea. I got really excited about, Artery Beirut existing in the same community as Artery Toronto and Artery Baghdad in New York for all the reasons we just discussed. What has been amazing to me this last year, piloting Artery this last year and a half, and specifically in Toronto, has been within a city. Take Dufferin Grove, or you're in the Junction, or you're in Scarborough. Scarborough doesn't necessarily know Scarborough. We know our neighbors on our street, likely, but these days we don't know the people on the street, one street over or two streets over. And I think that there has been at the same time we've had the rise of these online to offline trusting communities, we've had a lot of the existing communities that we've relied on, places of worship, libraries, community centers, not become less relevant in our lives, because the library, I will fight for that till the end. That's a really important place, but they have other things have overtaken those. And so that social infrastructure we've relied on for generations is becoming less and less central to us just going through the process of our daily lives. Right. And I think what has been really interesting for us has been learning that in trying to understand, I'm now seeing people walk into their neighbors' homes, into their homes in their neighborhood that they never would have walked into because of Artery. And what I'm realizing is that's like awakening a muscle that is not gone, but has atrophied greatly because we haven't had to use it as much in the last decade around curiosity and trust in our neighbors. And, I realize that if you want someone to, sort of bringing it full circle for me, if we're busy, there's a lot of information in the world, thinking about what to care about is overwhelming. But the only way you can really inspire someone to care and think deeply or be curious about what's going on in Damascus with someone else is if that muscle is alive and working and being exercised here. So I actually see, people going into strangers' homes, these trusting communities, certainly through what we do with Artery, as sort of allowing us to build that muscle and that curiosity and trust. And what I'm excited for is that what does that then allow for when you're confronted with people not just 2 streets away or, in another city or another country. And I really see that connection now. So it's seeing it less being a content thing than actually the way we understand the world is the way we live our lives locally.
This episode is brought to you by Hover.com. Everyone's got their thing. My thing is the joy of missing out, and Hover's is the joy of free domain registration privacy. Hover is an incredible company, actually based here in Canada, which is where I live, and I use Hover for all of my domain registration, and I have for years and years. I'm thrilled that they are here on board with the JOMOcast in the very first season. And as a listener, you can go to hover.com/JOMOcast to get your next great idea registered in a domain at Hover. So thank you to Hover for sponsoring season 1 of the JOMOcast. I think there's something so powerful, and I know you know this because of exactly what you're creating, in entering someone else's personal space.
Yes.
I went into a friend's living room the other day just for a few minutes because I was picking my kid up, and just being in her living room, I actually said it out loud.
Standing in the front.
Just standing inside her space.
Yeah.
I remember I just commented to her, I need to spend more time in people's homes. I've gotten into a habit of meeting people, for coffee at a public space. But when you walk into someone's room, and I did this when I came to your first Artery showcase that I ever attended, The first thing that I do is I look at people's books, right?
Me too.
You look at the books and it tells you a story. I'm looking over at the bookshelves in this exact room.
With your books right now, Christina.
I know, right? You can see all of my husband's science fiction. I've embraced it slowly over time. Yeah, I think one of the assumptions that I realize I'm trying to confront with this joy of missing out conversation is 3 assumptions. The first is that more is better, that faster is better. And what is the last one? More is better, faster is better, and new is better. New, faster, better. And those are these primary promises a lot of the time from advertising, from the technology space in particular. We're constantly trying to move faster. We think about companies like Amazon, like how much quicker can we get this product to your door? Right. All of these things. But when I think about what is necessary to build really meaningful relationships, I think in the opposite direction. I think less is better, slower is better. And I think what you're creating with Artery is an invitation for people to slow and to build sort of this very intimate web in their local community. I love what you said about, Scarborough doesn't know Scarborough, Toronto doesn't know Toronto. I think it's true that some of us know our neighbors, living in a community as tightly packed as I do. We, are almost forced to connect with our neighbor because they're literally standing right there. But if you go into more suburban communities, people are far more spaced out. People live in towers. Even though they want to know their neighbors, it's very difficult because people are on different schedules. And so, I would love for you to just explain to us what happens when someone goes to Artery, to the website, and and walk us through that process.
Yeah. So, to all of those things, I think that's, what you said, that last point, was that new is not always better. Artery is based on a really, really old idea, right? The idea of culture in private spaces, of community in private spaces, is as old as culture itself, right? Beethoven would recognize an Artery showcase more than he would some of these venue events. Chamber music came out of bedrooms. You think about Harlem rent parties, right, in the 1920s, and you think about Parisian salons. This impulse to connect in intimate ways, just where we live, is a very human impulse. And so I always say that what we're doing with Artery is not anything new. This has existed, and this does exist in every city and town in the world today in some way. So I just wanted to be really clear about that. And so, when people say, oh, this is a bit of a revolution in how people are going to connect, and I'll get into the process of it, I always come back and say it's very much a counter-revolution. And that gets me really excited because we're using technology, an online tool, to allow people to connect to something that humans have always done. And to connect to people offline, because the majority of the Artery experience doesn't happen online. It all happens offline. So with Artery, there's sort of 3 groups. You can come into Artery as a performer, someone who wants to showcase or exhibit something. And it could be anyone from an author to a comedian to a poet to a singer. We've had a scientist recently talking about ideas like black holes and astrophysics in living rooms.
Very cool.
And then there are hosts on Artery, and hosts are anyone with a space. Could be your living room, my backyard, a rooftop. We've had
Salimah's bathroom.
Oh, we have had an opera in my bathroom. That'll be another podcast, or we can go into that later. So we've had everything the size of dorm rooms to castles on Artery, and really the space, the experience fits into the space. And then there's the audience, and that is all of us. I hope all of you listening to begin with, who can go onto Artery and discover the showcases that come out of performers and hosts connecting. Mm-hmm. And Artery showcases are above all intimate. They're intimate experiences. These aren't 150, 100 person, 200 person shows. They're usually 15 to kind of 40 people, usually about 20, 25 people is a great number for an Artery, because living rooms, most of us don't have living rooms that can fit 60 people in there. And so so that's the basic idea. And so you can go into Artery and You can grab a spot to a showcase. There are public and private showcases. And for the public showcases, you can RSVP, limited spots. And when you RSVP, you will get the address on RSVP. No addresses are public. And get, sort of a note from the host saying, this is my address and anything particular to their location. And this is what people find really astounding, is that like all of a sudden you get this address and now you knock on someone's door and they invite you in. And it's I think we feel that when we visit friends we haven't seen in a long time. Like you said, like it's amazing to be in their home because it feels there's a generosity, there's an intimacy that you have with that person. And when you do it with a stranger, now you bring in trust. And so actually, if you have a little bit of anxiety, if you've never walked into a stranger's home through one of these showcases and you're listening, thinking about your first Artery, that anxiety you might have about, wait, I'm going into a stranger's home, that actually is what eventually creates the magic, because you have to sort of lean in halfway and the host and the audience lean halfway. So all these showcases feel very different than events because they're a co-creation. If I'm opening up my doors with trust and generosity and you are showing up in my home with that same type of trust and generosity, and an artist or a speaker is coming in and from 2 feet away sharing their gift, that is all a co-creation. And so you remove one element out of that and you don't have the showcase.
Right.
And I think that's I think in specifically culture, especially over the last many decades, we've got into this consumer producer model that culture is produced over here and you're invited to consume it across an orchestra pit or a stage. And it can be quite costly and it's largely centralized in downtown communities. And so where I get really excited with Artery is that no, it's culture is where you live. Culture is on your street. And I don't just say that based on the fact that we want to bring it there. I actually believe so much of the creative life of our cities is invisible because it's happening in our neighborhoods and it's happening in our communities outside even the downtown core. But there's just been no way to easily surface that and discover that and even offer, your home for that. And so that's what I get really excited. And so, when people enter people's homes, I think what happens is that you genuinely leave with connection, and you there's a gratefulness there that I find, or a gratitude that is part of the process that is not typically part of the way we consume culture now, and it has let us be less creative, less experimental. And you brought up a really good point about how difficult it is. And I think people want to connect in these ways with each other. But, after you graduate university or you're in a job or you've got kids or your kids have, moved out and you're an empty nester, how do you connect and have these social bonds and discover this stuff is actually really challenging. And I think one of the really interesting things when you enter someone's home, you're not just entering a home for performance, you are stepping into their life for that moment. And even when you were with your friend, you can know me, but when you're in my home, you can have a sense of my life and my values and what I care about. And I think increasingly with technology, especially to sort of bring it back to this idea that we're more connected than we've ever been online. But we're increasingly isolated from each other in real life to dangerous degrees. I mean, the loneliness is an epidemic, and getting out of our cultural bubbles, both addressing loneliness and social isolation, which is a huge problem. The UK, alone has just, introduced a minister of loneliness, and there are studies that loneliness will be a higher threat to public health than obesity or heart disease over the coming years. That is certainly something that I think we have to really sit back and think as a society. On the other side of that, one of the consequences we can see of being on these social networks is the algorithms and is how they are pushing us further into our own cultural bubbles.
Yeah.
And so you can be on the internet all day and never be around any community that thinks differently than you, or that has different experiences than you, or has different demographic or racial or socioeconomic backgrounds than you. And the consequences of us, I think, not being able to break out of that cultural bubble are a rise in, we see it all around us. I think we see it in our politics being calcified. And so it's really, really critical. And so for me, thinking about ways, and whether you come at this as a writer, as an educator, as someone building what we're building in Artery, trying to figure out ways where people have the opportunity to be in a room with people they would not necessarily always be in a room with, because I can argue with you on Facebook and we can yell at each other. But if we're sitting in real life and we're sharing an experience together and then we disagree, I mean, I begin with the principle that you're human. And
Right.
and I remember that. So then I'm showing up to that conversation in a totally different way. I'm not being anonymized. And so you can't replace the physical connection and understanding. I know this is something like, this is your life's work as well.
I'm just sitting here nodding and just making big doughy eyes at Salimah, like just yes, yes, yes. Yeah, I mean, the empathy, right? I mean, it comes back to that always about what it means to be human, and the fact that from infancy we're seeking out the eyes of other human beings to, right? It's like mirroring and building out what it means to be human in the ways that we relate to one another. So when we remove that intimacy, when we remove that connection, it allows for a lot of ugliness, and we see it online.
Yes.
And so, it's kind of the great meme of celebrities reading mean tweets, right?
Yeah.
Is, would you say this to my face? The truth is 99.9% of people would never do that. And so I love how you're bringing your journalistic conflict zone background into this discussion, because in Canada, I think, at least in my environment, we're quite peaceful, but I know that in America, obviously this is a huge discussion in terms of the polarization between people.
And I think, yes, obviously as a Canadian, I'm proud of so much of what happens in our country around dialogue, around understanding, but there's a lot of misunderstanding here. And the fact of the matter is that even in my daily life, for example, when I'm in Toronto, yeah, I'm still in my cultural bubble. And, how often am I, being based in the West End of Toronto, how often am I in Scarborough or Mississauga in someone's home? Maybe, and we see that, I think, in our own politics here, in our mayoral politics, right? Between the city and the suburbs. So I think all of those things are happening at every level.
My immediate thought is, it already feels like a risk for me to go into a stranger's house within my own neighborhood. What would I be willing to, would I be willing to risk going to somewhere so far outside of my own experience, like Scarborough, for example? Not to harsh on Scarborough. We love you, Scarby. But
oh my God, I love Scarborough.
I
love Scarborough.
I know so many good people.
My way through Scarborough.
But that ask of ourselves to not just get out of our comfort zone and say no to watching Netflix for yet another night, but going into our local community, but then taking it a step further into, would we go, in Toronto, the joke of like the East versus West, right? Like,
Totally.
Would I be willing to go all the way to the East End to experience something completely different? I think this is also where we can lean into our current friendships and relationships. I can imagine going to my first Artery showcase and bringing a friend, right?
Yep.
And that's a beautiful thing, right? There's nothing wrong about bringing like a little, comfort blanket, a little.
People bring their communities.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean,
and marriages, like people are hooking up, like people, like relationships are starting through Artery. And I shouldn't say hook up, relationships.
Yeah.
Of all kinds.
People are finding friendships. There are people dating on Artery. Some long-term relationships have emerged. We're waiting for the first Artery wedding or whatever type of partnership celebration they want. And I think it's not a secret ingredient. It's like if there's around a shared experience, if you're able to spend some time with an intimate group of people. But I do think it's really difficult. Like, even if we were to, you come home on Thursday night and you're tired and, it's cold. And yes, you want to connect with, the other outer boroughs, and you want to connect with everybody, neighborhoods. But how do you do that? And I think that puts a lot of pressure on all of us to kind of be sort of these like, superheroes. And that's asking a lot too.
Yeah.
Like, and I kind of realized that with my journalism, like asking someone to like understand all about the world or asking them to know about an issue or the consequences of the war in Iraq, like everyone is dealing with a lot in their own lives. So yeah, the way I look at it is if you can offer someone, a small shared experience that lasts 60 to 90 minutes that may even be in their own neighborhood, that's a place to start. And I guess, I'm also, of the belief that, what has come before us allows for now to exist. And I'm really excited about beyond Artery. If, 1,000 people in one neighborhood end up over that year in each other's homes in any sort of arrangement, what else does that allow for in terms of that community and organizing and civic engagement? So, I remember talking to when we were building the Spirit Bear Youth Coalition and the environmental movement, and we were very lucky enough to have Dr. Jane Goodall as a mentor. And I remember, years in, because you begin something and then you're in the middle, and it's very hard and up and down sort of look the same. And I remember asking her, like, it seems so large, like it seems so overwhelming, the challenges that exist in the world. What is your advice? And her advice was really simple and clear and came in a minute. And she says, just find your peace in it. Start somewhere. Down your street, Earth Rangers, great place to start. Find your peace in it. And I think we can get, and I can get, believe me, I can get paralyzed as well. And I think that's I love your expression of it as an invitation. I just think we just need more invitations like JOMO, like Artery, out there.
Amazing. I asked Salimah to bring the Artery bell, and I want her to play it for us now.
Wow.
So can you explain to us what this is and how it functions within your community?
Yeah. So, people are gathering in homes, and some people are used to hosting people and some aren't. And we realize that first moment where people are in your home and then you want to begin the performance or the lecture or the show, can be sort of awkward for people. And we thought a lovely way for a host to sort of bring people's attention was through a bell. And it started as that, and the community loves it. And so it's now become part of the beginnings of an Artery. So I will play this bell with the caveat that those who aren't musicians build platforms for those who can build musicians for musicians. So this is the Artery bell. Ta-da! And what's interesting, what's really exciting to see is that even amongst, we began in sort of piloting in Toronto, community started also growing in New York. Those are our two pilot cities. But Artery communities have been growing in 12 other cities, from Reykjavik to small community in Spain, to Washington, to Vancouver, to Montreal, to Ottawa. We've had invite requests from 35 countries. And what's neat is that when you come together with similar values around intimacy, around sharing experience, you can actually introduce some shared traditions amongst a community that lives around the world. So I sort of see this as a shared tradition. And it's kind of fun just to hammer on a bell, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Right?
And the one I went to at your place, the youngest audience member, who may have been about 5 or 6,
I think he was like 4.
4. He had this bell, and you should have just seen the look on this kid's face, just the power that he held in his hand. And just that small little person was able to gather an entire apartment full of people.
Yeah, his name was Van, and he's actually approached me about co-hosting his first Artery. So he'll be the youngest co-host of an Artery. He came to the performance that you came to. My living room was Julie Nasrallah of CBC was doing an opera in my living room to about 30 people. And Van attended half of that, which is pretty good for a 4-year-old.
He had a lot of oranges.
Yep. And since his mom had sort of put him in touch and via voice notes on texting, and he's going to be hosting a showcase for his community. And I'm happy to help him, and he'll have a bell.
I love it.
So every host gets a bell when they join Artery and they do their first Artery.
It's incredible. I have 2 questions for you.
Please.
The first is, JOMO to you means missing out on what? JOMO means missing out on...
JOMO means removing FOMO.
Yeah.
To me, like, that's the first thing that comes in, is that, you know, when you're so connected online and like 1,000 things are happening on Instagram and Facebook and constantly, JOMO means presence. Like, to me, I'm going to not fit it in, but like being joyful about where you are. And of course you're going to be missing out on something else, but that's the nature of being present.
Absolutely. You have to miss out on something to embrace something else.
Yeah.
And lastly, Salimah, I want you to finish the sentence. I want to find more joy in
the middle, the process. I think there's this quote that I recently heard by Rosabeth Moss-Cantor. She was a professor at Harvard. And it's this quote that just sort of resonated with me. It said, in the middle, everything feels like failure. And that can apply to so many aspects of our lives and certainly our work. And I think that's also where the joy is. You know, everyone loves the happy, you know, the exciting beginning, and we're all in love with a happy ending. But the middle is where we lean in to each other with trust. The middle is where, when we fall, the people who love us are there to hold us. The middle is the good stuff.
It is the good stuff. Thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you, Christina. Always.
Well, thank you for listening. You can learn more about our guests in the show notes and by visiting JOMOCast.com. The JOMOCast is edited and produced by Thomas J. Inge, musician and composer by day, podcast ninja by night. Special thanks to writer Rebecca Wigand, musician Peter Katz, and educator Adam Kaplan for their practical and moral support creating this season of the podcast. The JOMOCast is listener supported. When you sign up as a patron at patreon.com/JOMOCast, you'll get access to mini bonus episodes with me and digital sociologist Dr. Jess Purium. Plus, we'll send you a JOMO Manifesto letterpress print, stickers, and a handwritten card in the mail because I believe in the power of the personal. Plus, snail mail is just one of the most joyful things on earth. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review it on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you subscribe. And a 5-star review would be spectacular. Do you want more JOMO? Go to experiencejomo.com to sign up for a free week of JOMO quests to get you started on your journey. As always, remember, there is joy missing out on the right things. I'm your host, Christina Crook. Thanks for listening.